I'm Madelyn Blair, and this is Unlocked. Now, if you're serious about your career, this show is for you because this is a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options from which to choose. Now, speaking of choices, I'm delighted that you chose to be with us today because we're going to be talking about something we take for granted and at the same time don't always see the benefits. Our topic today is form and freedom. Now, how many of you cringe when you're asked to fill out a form? Now, I'm raising my hand because I find it so boring to write about what should be well known about me by, say, my doctor. Yet there is that form to fill out yet again. Well, that's not the kind of form we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about forms that are sometimes called the structures of our organizations. Are we top-down or matrix? Or the frameworks that guide our thinking. Are we always expected to think logically? Or the law. Yes, we have to stop at a stop sign. Or the words that are always expected on certain occasions. Oh, she's so cute. Forms weave through all aspects of our lives. They make things feel more efficient or more comfortable or safer or just easier. We're going to expand on this thinking today with someone who has been working in this arena for many years. If you would like to ask her any question, what would it be? Would you be interested in how she defines form? Would you be more interested in the spark that drove her to exploring the freedom that can come from form? Take a minute and jot down your questions. And if you're watching live on YouTube or LinkedIn, put your questions in the chat so that we can tackle them. I'll give you a minute to write them down, so stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching or listening to Unlocked. I'm Madelyn Blair, your host. Our guest today is Lesley Diaz. Welcome, Lesley, to Unlocked. Oh, let me bring Lesley in. Wait a minute. Here she is. Welcome, Lesley.
Thank you, Madelyn. It's so lovely to see you.
Oh, thank you so much. And let me just, before we get into our discussion, I want to remind people to put their questions into YouTube or LinkedIn if they're watching, so we can catch them. We'll be monitoring them a bit later. Well, Lesley, I'm just so happy to have you with me today. And I was thinking as we prepared for today that we really have known each other for some time through that book called Essays in Two Voices. You know, I tell my audiences, if you have a question or a topic you want me to explore on the show, send them to me. And if I use it, I'll send you a copy of my book, Essays in Two Voices. But I never talk about that book. So, Lesley, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience with essays in two voices?
Yeah, would love to. So I think that came up in the very first conversation that you and I had, which must have been about 20 years ago. Maybe not that long, maybe 15. But it was a lunchtime conversation, and we were talking about some work that I was doing with Waldorf schools at the time. And I'm not entirely sure. It's one of those emergent things that just comes out of a delightful conversation. And it was this idea that you can actually provide some form, some simple form around just the number of words that people needed to use and the methodology that you were going to use to engage with another person through these words. And this simple form really unlocked a whole lot of possibility. The simple form was really just writing 500 words on an agreed topic, exchanging those ideas, and then using those as a sounding board or a bouncing off point, a catalyst for some of your own thinking, and then going through a process of switching ideas backwards and forwards until you reached, which I thought was lovely, this tweet length destination, if you like. And it was a beautiful process of distillation, but without a lot of control, without a lot of rules, but just this simple, write 500 words, exchange it, halve it, write 250 words, exchange it. And I started exploring and practicing how could I use that in my own life and also in my teaching. And used that, found what I discovered was that people who had writer's block or writer's anxiety found those very simple frameworks to be sort of really permission then not to have to go into any particular format, not to have to meet any specific kind of academic style of writing or whatever, and the depth and the openness that happened when you had that permission was just remarkable. So that's been my journey with that.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. I have to say, it's actually being used on 4 continents. So people who've
I can believe it
use it in different ways. So thank you for that. Well,
no, you're welcome.
I want to introduce you a little more formally to our audience because they need to know why you're here as well. Lesley is the Director of Organizational Development at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, where she and her team partner closely with other members of the human resources team and with business leaders throughout the organization to solve complex challenges relating to the growth and development of individuals, teams, and the organization as a whole. She's also an adjunct professor at Madelyn College, where she teaches organizational behavior, systems thinking, and leadership. And prior to this, Lesley was owner and principal change agent of Collaborance, where she emphasized collaboration. So I suspect we're going to hear a little bit about that too. Well, Lesley, let's just take a second. Let people also know you, maybe from another aspect. What drew you to this kind of work, for example?
It's an interesting story. You asked me to think about that, and the answer is actually outside of the business realm. This is this play between personal interests and how those interests guide your career. And in my case, I was in theatre and singing groups for a really long time. I loved it at school. It was everything that I did at school, and found that there was this very interesting kind of metaphor within large singing groups. If you sing by yourself, then there's, you can have a little bit of an impact. But when you start singing with bigger and bigger and bigger choirs and then orchestras and all the rest of it, it feels like your impact is magnified on a really grand scale. And there were so many little lessons that you learned about harmony and what harmony did. And then relating, so that was related to collaboration, which is you can't make some of these sounds, and you certainly can't make really big sounds and a really big impact. You also can't always have that really deeply emotional impact on people without the harmony and the change and the mood that's available if you're singing as part of a much bigger group. And then with the theatre, when you actually move that into the theatre rather than just choirs, you start thinking about all of the things that have to happen in order for a production to come together. And so every single piece, every single detail contributes to the overall mission. And so there was just this really strong resonance for me between those personal experiences that I'd had growing up, how wonderful they felt to be part of something like that, and then the connection into the workplace. So that was, that's that piece around collaboration and how I got into that field.
Oh, I love that story. And story is such a powerful medium for conveying what's actually a very complex issue, concept. And yet now I see it. It was like, oh, well, of course.
And so many people have a sporting analogy for collaboration, which is true too. So a lot of experiences that I've had have been around that as well. But there's something really unique about collaboration in the theatrical concept, because there's no competition. No one's competing against anybody else. It really is everybody coming together, which even includes the audience. If you actually start to think about the audience needs to be there in order for the players to achieve their best, and everybody lifts each other up, and this idea of shared mission, there are endless possibilities for analogy and metaphors. So
great. Yes. Well, now our topic is form and freedom. So why don't we begin with that word form? I mean, I talked about all kinds of forms, but what do you think that people tend to resist? Let's begin with, what do we mean by form? And then maybe, why do you think that people tend to resist form?
Yeah, I think there's a real misunderstanding with regards to form. So if I could answer sort of both of those questions together, one of the reasons why we resist form so much is because we come to see it connected with discipline imposed from the outside, discipline imposed by somebody else, expectations imposed by somebody else. So if you go way back, this idea of bureaucracy was intended to be able to bring agreements and structure in a really helpful way that would allow really large groups of people to cooperate on a scale that they had never done in, historically. But over time, what's happened with that is it's become synonymous with control, that people are imposing these kinds of rules and regulations. And you mentioned it before, legal stuff and forms and policy. And a lot of that has become, like I said, people are resistant to it because they've seen the negative side of that and have not really seen the positive side of that.
I think you're right there. And it just pervades our entire lives. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Everywhere.
So let's now flip to that other word, freedom. It has a lot of interpretations and a lot of understandings. I remember one time at the Smithsonian, I asked people in the audience, I said, I want you to turn to your partner and share a story about the word freedom. What comes to your mind? We were only able to share a couple of the stories from the audience because it was a large audience, obviously, in the auditorium. But it was amazing how different people, what different kinds of stories came forward as they thought about this word freedom. One was a brother and a sister who, the brother said, oh, I just wanted to be free and do whatever I wanted to do. And it turned out he was one of 5 boys. And his sister said freedom to her was being able to find a quiet space. Well, as soon as they said there's 2 stories, the audience roared because they said, oh my goodness, they could see it and they could feel the fact that this understanding of freedom is so different. So sorry, I'll pass it to you, ask you to talk about freedom.
I think freedom is much more difficult to define, actually, because of what you've just said. It's that very unique and internal thing that allows us to have that expression of who we are as an identity. And it's the opposite of what we described before. I like how, in the context of what we're talking about, if we're talking about careers, how Daniel Pink has really sort of looked at freedom through the lens of, say, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That what we're really trying to do is have some say over our lives. And I think that's shifted. In fact, through the pandemic, it's really shifted, where the kinds of autonomy that people are looking to have. I heard couple of days ago that New York City is something like 8% of people. They're expecting 8% of the workforce to return to work full time, because this autonomy or this freedom to work from home has created a whole lot of health benefits, family benefits, and the pendulum has really shifted. So there's a very temporal thing to what freedom means. Freedom in the 1800s was very different to freedom in the 1900s. We have this, we're sort of on this trajectory, this journey towards more and more and more freedom, because there's more and more technology that allows us to do things in our own way. There's just an orientation towards freedom culturally in the United States, which is different even coming from Australia. I even noticed that difference, even though Australia and the United States are very similar organizations. Very similar countries and cultures. I'll talk about some of the things that were familiar to me in Australia, and people will see that as, pardon me, that's my phone. I don't think I can silence that. I hope it's not coming through too loud. Bear with me one second.
We're just going to ignore it. We're going to ignore it.
If somebody starts talking, I don't want that to be playing in the background. Speaking of technology, this is very old technology. I can't shift that one.
We were talking about the US and Australia.
So even things that I would say, were familiar to me, people would see that as being a level of restriction on their freedom that felt uncomfortable in the United States. So there's that cultural difference. And I think, as I said, we've got this orientation towards wanting more and more and more. But what happens with that when you get complete freedom, or when there's no form or structure around that, is I think people get very confused, very lost, very disoriented. And so it's, we're sort of probably moving into one of your future questions, but there's something about being able to retranslate what those words are and what positive qualities they bring to our lives that is really worth exploring, and has been something that's been of interest to me over the years.
I really appreciate your comparing the two country cultures, because that's very hard when you sit in one to see from another perspective. Yeah. I was talking to somebody in London the other day, and she made a generalization about Americans. And I went, wow, I would not have thought of that. But it was okay. It was a reasonable thing. So, all right. Well, let's see. We've talked then a little bit about freedom and a little bit about form. I want us to really begin to kind of come into how those two things actually relate to one another, because I think they do. But I want to hear from you first.
Yeah, for sure. So when you start to see them as being related, and when you start to see them as being mutually connected, you can start to separate out the difference between form that is at that unhelpful bureaucratic end, and freedom that is at that unhelpful end that leads to confusion and lack of effectiveness and all those sorts of things. And this is where, I don't know whether maybe putting up that illustration would be really helpful. This is where through my own sort of interest in this area, seeing that these are sort of two ends of the spectrum, and that in their extremes, you end up with on the top end here, I call this evaporative. So if you go to that very, very, which I'm now sort of starting to call that hot end of the spectrum, you've got a very evaporative quality that happens when you have no boundaries at all. Things just expand almost as if they were like gas. And so they become volcanic in their expression. They become very evaporative. And they don't do very. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about with this analogy as I was playing with this as a sort of metaphor or as an illustration. If you think about this as being gas, then the opposite end of that is ice, where you've got very rigid form, which is the kind of stuff that we try to resist. And there's no movement in that. There's no room for individualization. There's no room for newness or change or whatever. And so you've got this thinking about freedom and form using the metaphor of water as the analogy. When water gets too cold and frozen, it becomes very, very rigid, and it has a very, very strong structure that resists any change and fractures if you try and move it in any way. If you heat it up too far, you end up with gas, and gas goes out into all corners of the room, and you find yourself very, very disconnected from everybody else. So what we're trying to do is sort of really find that really helpful middle space where water is fluid and dynamic, and it is then able to be moved, and you can shift and change without breaking all of the bonds. So if you then start linking that with collaboration, if your goal is individualization, at the extreme levels, you lose connection from everybody. If your goal is form, you get to the point where people have no room for self-expression, no room for individualization, no room for diversity of thought or whatever. So this has always been very helpful for me when sort of working as a consultant, coming in and saying, where am I seeing too much of something? Where am I seeing too much rigidity, too little room for change or newness or new thinking? So I see that as being down in that sort of icy realm. And then also with other organizations or with other groups, where do I see way too much individualization? So the teams are actually never able to cohere or come up with any sort of things like a cohesive mission. I mean, you and I were talking backstage about working with Essays in Two Voices as a way of being able to get mission statements. You can't get to a place of mission if you don't have agreement. So this is where, and it's interesting because I now talk about warm form. When I talk to people, I don't talk about structure. I don't use the word bureaucracy. I don't use the word policy. I say, where can we bring some warm form and where can we bring some agreement around these topics? And that translation helps people say, oh, okay, and brings us, sort of into that middle space.
Warm form. I think that's
warm form.
that is a great use of language. I mean, it rhymes, it rolls off the tongue, warm form. And it's a totally different way to think about the appropriate form of things, to
Right.
allow for movement, to allow for productivity, and at the same time, sufficient comfort, cohesiveness, comfort, rather than this gaseous, wonderful.
And then to take the metaphor just a little bit to stop being silly about it, the same way that you can with that whole choir and theatre mentality. But with this one, you start saying, okay, if you want all these individuals to do work, you actually have to compress them. In a steam engine, the only reason that a steam engine works is when you put it under pressure. And so, again, endless possibilities for being able to help people see that the behaviors that they're engaging in are unhelpful and help them calibrate, okay, how much form do we need to bring? And it's the least amount of form that you need to bring in order to have to get you down into that sort of fluid range. Likewise with the heating up or the warming of the policies, the least amount of heat that allows you to get into that, again, fluid, dynamic, collaborative space. So
that warm form.
Warm form.
Now, do you want to move to the other, or do we want to do a little bit more on this? Because I have been known to say that creativity actually emerges from structure. I think so often, and I think you've said it well, Lesley, is that people who are creatives, you think that they need to have a completely open blank canvas. And yet last week I interviewed a jeweler who custom designs the jewelry for her clients. And she said, the first thing I do is I begin to think of what they want, and it becomes an aspect that she says, I put in this little box. She literally says, I put it in a little box, and yet whatever's in that box is what guides me. I thought it was wonderful because she was very creative. Her jewelry was just spectacular. So I'll stop there and let you comment on that creativity emerges from the structure.
And it's interesting because I've heard that spoken to a lot of creative people, and most of them will say the same thing. So this is a widely lived experience, that when you're staring at a blank canvas, if you don't have any form at all, like, will I use paint? Will I use ink? Will I use whatever? There's no starting point. That there needs to be some sort of form to help you make a decision. You use the word choice in your opening. Mm-hmm. That's the choice to make a mark on the paper, or to sculpt, or something like that. And I have my own creative story around that one. I get distracted into all sorts of creative art forms. Like, I pick them up, I do them for 12 months, and then I drop them. Yeah. And a friend of mine introduced me a long time ago. I'm almost embarrassed to tell this story. A long time ago, to creative stamping, which was getting the stamps and the inks, and just I made envelopes and cards and all that sort of stuff. And I said to myself, because I am so terrible at getting distracted, I'm going to buy myself one stamp, and I'm going to buy myself 2 colors. I think I ended up getting 3 colors, because there was a pad that had 3 colors in it. And I said, I'm going to work with this for a year. For a year, I'm just going to work with everything that I can do with this one stamp and this one set of inks. And it was really interesting to see just how far you could take it. If you knew you only had this one flower, what could you do with the one flower? And so I started experimenting things like, well, what happens? How do I layer the flowers on top of each other? What happens if I, put them in a line? What happens if you just experimented so much more broadly in order to get the effect that you wanted? What happens if I use masks? What happens if I use embossing, stuff? By restricting yourself to just that one image, you had to be creative in order to do, to come up with something original and interesting. Whereas as I started, and here's the paradox in that, as I started buying, of course, a lot shorter than 12 months, I started buying more stamps. You started then saying, oh, I still don't have enough. I need something else in order to be able to do this thing. Mm-hmm. And so I now have a fishing tackle box full of unused stamps. Like I said, I'm a little embarrassed to tell that story. But I think that's what happens again with now sort of migrating that back into the world of work or the world of life. When you keep on saying, I don't have enough, I need something else, you're not forced to use that creative instinct, which is, how can I use what I already have to achieve the result that I'm looking for, rather than looking for something outside. I have what I need, and how can I use that in a really, really thoughtful, creative, mindful way, without sort of reaching for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing.
As you were talking, Lesley, all I could think of was the technology industry. I can see them. I can see it right now. They got one thing. They got one stamp, and they started to get creative, and they got ideas. So we have this one and this one. And now we live in so many technical pieces. I mean, I'm literally sitting at a table that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of technology around me.
Now, and in fact, we had this conversation just yesterday, because yesterday we sat with the team to, my team to start planning our fall catalogue, our fall catalogue. This is what we're going to deliver in fall. Mm-hmm. Part of the conversation was what tools are we going to use to hold ourselves accountable? And different people, I'd given people permission, bring your tool, bring what you, and we literally had 5 or 6 options. We have 7 people on the team, and we had 5 or 6 options. And it's ridiculous that you spend half of the meeting deciding what planning tool you're going to use to help you plan, and then only half the meeting to decide what are you actually going to do. So I find myself all the time asking or saying, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Yeah. And that so applies to technology. Just because there is this wonderful new thing that does blah, blah, doesn't mean that that's going to be helpful. Yeah. It's challenging for people then. And on a more serious note, then you find yourself spending half of your planning meeting talking about the technology. And that's not a good use of time.
No.
So,
this leads into my next question for you, which is, you're about building a more effective organization. So
Mhm.
tell us what this means. How do you do this, and how does it relate to form and freedom? I think you've given us one example, but I know there's much more.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned before, certainly harking back to my consulting days, that there was always this consciousness that I was, or a question that I was asking as I go into a new client: what's missing here, or what is there an overabundance of? And as the consultant, it's my job to bring the opposite of that, or to help them come from these extreme ends of the spectrum into that more dynamic middle space. And one of the things that I think really hurts organizations is, and again, you mentioned it when we were talking about mission statements. This is what that warm form looks like. That warm form is shared agreements around how we're going to do things. It's the conversation that allows us to say, these are our methods and processes. These are our commitments to each other that will allow us to work collaboratively. And if you have a look at some organizations that are way up on that individualization, spectrum, way up in that evaporative space, nothing can get done because everybody's got a preferred way of doing it. Everybody's working in their own silos. Everybody's got, can't say yes to anything because it needs to be their own way. That prevents organizations from being effective. It prevents teams from being successful because you're constantly having conversations about how you're going to do things and not about the impact that you're going to have on whatever you're coming together around. So a shared agreement around in healthcare, patient care, in manufacturing, about the quality of the product or whatever it might be. And so we spend so much time fighting each other for focus and direction. And then likewise, if you come back down to that very rigid end, you've got a whole lot of people who've got wonderful ideas to share, and there's no way that they can share them because there is a bureaucracy that fights against them being able to do things in a new way, or that change takes so much time because you've got these very, very rigid bonds and processes and methods that need to be broken in order for you to even get into that space. So a lot of the I guess a lot of the consciousness that I'm trying to bring when I'm working with groups is what are the self-limiting behaviors and mindsets that are preventing this group of people from being in that really dynamic, agile space. And I think, there's another word, this agility. Again, 1800s, Max Weber, bureaucracy, we needed this because we weren't used to working together, 100 people coming together to work on something. We needed that kind of form to be able to get people into that space. Now that journey has gone in another direction. And what's required of us is the capacity to be really agile, to be able to respond to changes in the external environment very quickly. And that demands a whole new set of skills. And that's very much more in that sort of middle space. When quickly we're able to come together and say, okay, what's the goal? What resources do we have? How can we use those resources to their greatest effect? And how can we let go of my role description says I need to do this. My job description prevents me from doing that. And much more looking at what are the skills that we need in order to be able to achieve whatever this shared commitment is, and how quickly can we bring those together to achieve the result. Because other people are doing it. If we're not doing it, other people are doing it. And the organizations that do that the most effectively are the ones that have greater market share, greater customer satisfaction, all of those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. You just gave us, I think, a really marvelous example of the aspect of coming together in a meeting and having to spend half the meeting talking about which tool and then get on with the business of the meeting. I wonder if you could share some challenge or disruption that you've had to work with in your current work. I know you can't reveal certain things, but if you could just talk about enough that we would understand what the kind of issue you were dealing with, and how you began to resolve that, or if you were able to resolve it.
So I think in a lot of organizations, this idea of siloed siloed work is a big challenge. And the other thing, so I'm going to put these two things together in order to sort of wrap it around an example. The other one is perfectionism. And perfectionism is another form of form. I can't release this until it's perfect. It's way down in that. I keep on, I talk a lot about polishing, keep on polishing and polishing and polishing. It's not quite ready. It's not quite ready. It's not quite ready. And so that prevents people from being able to share something with their colleagues because I'm so worried about the perfection that needs to be brought to that, which is, again, that very, very cold form, limiting form. And the silos, which is that I got to do it my way. We've figured this out. We're not willing to wait for you. We don't like the way you do it, so we're going to invent our own process. And so one of the things that I've been doing in my current role, and I talk about myself as being the connective tissue. Now that I'm in a healthcare facility, of course, no shortage of metaphors. Now I'm using that like the human body as a metaphor. And the organizational development department is really a putting in that connective tissue. Yeah. So one of the things that I've started to do is just randomly invite, not randomly, it appears random, is to really seek out people where I'm having great conversations with these individual people. I'm impressed and think that what they're doing is amazing. And I'm astounded that other people are not aware of what they're doing. So I'm literally just bringing them together. I call people, I say, you are on my list. I love talking to you. Every time I talk to you, I learn something. Would you like to come together with some other people that I've identified that I also love talking to, just for the purpose of talking with each other? Oh, and by the way, if you actually need something, like if you need a reason, because this all sounds a little bit too loosey-goosey, how about we do a book study? And we're going to choose the book study. And I've done things like the 7 essential coaching questions. So that every week, technically, we're talking about how to become better coaches, but really we're there to find out, what are you doing? Oh my God, that's amazing. Can I follow up with you and talk to you about how you've done that in your area? Or, oh, we need to connect because I'm doing this project and I didn't even know you existed. Yeah. And, so that would be another example, I think, where it's sort of trying to find that, again, that fluid space in the middle where I can't promise what's going to happen. I can promise you that if you do your reading, you'll have 7 essential coaching questions. At the end of 7 weeks, you'll have 7 questions that you can use a bit more effectively. But the other part, like, there's been just some amazing collaborations that have come out of that. New people who've said, oh my gosh, we need to get together because I didn't know who to find in the organization who could help me with this part of my work. And I just realized that you're the person that I needed to meet. So this is now a model that the 7 essential coaching questions, which is a useful skill for managers to have, is really now about creating that dynamic space of just letting go of perfection, letting go of any preconceived ideas about what we're going to learn, and just bringing together incredible, interesting, dynamic people so that they can share things that are useful. And I had 3 people on my first cohort who couldn't make it to all of the courses. It's a very busy organization. And all 3 of them have said, put me on the next cohort. I'm going to do this again because I missed so many of them and this is so valuable. Put me in with another group of people and I'll come again. I promise.
I love this because it is a, I don't know, it's the right way to say this. It is such a human way to resolve these issues. Instead of imposing a new policy, a new process, a new methodology, a new plan, you simply put the appropriate people together and gave them a place that was free enough that they could explore new areas.
Right. And then out of that, okay, what would bring you to the next one?
Yeah.
And one of my questions that I also go out to certain individuals and say, okay, you're busy. If I could get 10 people, it's like that dinner party conversation. If you could invite 12 people, alive or dead, to your dinner party, who would they be? And that's what I do. I say, what would be worth your time? If I'm asking you to give up one of your lunches for 7 weeks, who can I populate the room with that you go, oh, I'd love to be in a room with, the head of purchasing and the head of project management and the director of this and the,
Sure.
and so that's our model. Our model is start with who, and then give them a space for meaningful dialogue. And then, which is circling back to that essays into voices, it's a way of having meaningful dialogue. It's another way of having meaningful dialogue. So
Absolutely.
you've reminded me about that. I'm going to be noodling on how do I bring that into my work more consciously, more deliberately.
Oh, good.
Make everybody write an essay. That will make me popular.
Well, I have tried to do this verbally rather than writing, and you have to think very carefully about how you do that. Children love to do it with pictures, and then they describe the picture. So there are alternative ways, but the writing, however, is so powerful because writing forces you to articulate what you are trying to say. It may feel painful initially, but once it begins to flow, it's there. Yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, I think that you're learning all kinds of things as you do this work. What's one particular lesson that you've learned so far?
I actually, for the last couple of minutes, I've been thinking, how can I introduce this thing, which is inspiration that comes from all sorts of different places. And one area of inspiration, outside singing and theatre and all those other things, is the thought leaders. And Jim Collins has done quite a lot of work in this area. And there's two things in particular that have really become key principles to the way that I work. Those like operating systems. Go back to this question because this question always delivers a really good result. And the first one of those comes from, everybody knows him for Good to Great. Fewer people know him for Built to Last. And Built to Last was a book about how organizations stay relevant, how they outperform all of their competitors for a really long period of time. And he talks in that book about both and thinking, this capacity for organizations to have both and thinking, which is rather than we have to choose between people and profit. No, you don't. Both and thinking asks you, how can we deliver an environment that is really supportive of our people and is profitable? And that question is really getting at the crux of that form and freedom question. Because if I see one or other of those things as limiting, then I'm unable to see the possibilities within that. So that both and thinking, I think, is really, really valuable. He also brings an element to that of saying it's not everything all the time. There's certain things around which you must have a very high degree of form. He calls them the core of the organization, the core values, core principles, whatever. And he says, be ruthlessly, almost cult-like in your devotion. He uses that word, almost cult-like in your devotion to those few core principles, and then change everything else. So there's this idea of form and freedom, like playing out inside this question all the time. So where can we have a hard no, that is outside the boundaries of what we do? And it comes back to something that I wanted to the word that I wanted to mention was the value that values can really play when you're doing this work. So values are really around those those very, again, human principles that say, when it comes to profit, we will do everything that we need to do except this, because these are the non-negotiables. These are the things that are core to who we believe we are as human beings, as corporate citizens, as whatever. So that idea, I think, has been really, really helpful for me in saying to people, and I know I've worked with other organizations where I go in and say, what is your unapologetic no? What is your unapologetic core? Where we would happily lose clients, patients, market share, blah, 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 if it meant that we had to compromise on this thing. What are those things? A very small number of them. So helping people really hone in on what is your unapologetic core? That's one sort of really big takeaway for me, because that's the That's often the sticking point, because people, when they're still starting to work with this idea of form and freedom, really have struggle with what belongs in the form end and what belongs in the freedom end. And this helps answer that question. What are the things that you would never compromise because they are so fundamental to who you are as a human being, as a team, as an organization? And that's really helpful. And then change everything else. And what does it mean to change everything else? And then the other thing, which is also from Jim Collins and is from Good to Great, it's not about buses and seats on buses, which is, again, what most people take away from his work. He talks about a culture of discipline. And it's really interesting how this word discipline is starting to permeate a lot of our language now, a lot of our corporate language. People are starting to realize that we've leveraged as much as we can out of getting smarter with more technology and more frameworks and more whatever. But it's the discipline of applying those that delivers the result. And we're starting to realize we've underinvested in this idea of discipline and asking people to do things in a really simple, clear, consistent way to achieve a result. And he says, and I'm going to read this, so forgive me if my eyes are darting, when you have disciplined people, you don't need hierarchy. When you have disciplined thought, you don't need bureaucracy. When you have disciplined action, you don't need excessive controls. When you combine a culture of discipline with an ethic of entrepreneurship, you get the magic alchemy of great performance. So it's a bit of a long quote. But for people who are interested, I have prepared a few slides if people want to, if there's a way of you being able to make those available.
I will make them available. Yep.
And that's one of the quotes. This idea of disciplined people is the antidote to hierarchy, that disciplined thinking is the antidote to bureaucracy, and that disciplined action, which is this consistent holding each other accountable for the things that you say you're going to do, gives you the freedom from that imposed control.
Yeah.
So those two have been very, very helpful concepts for me as I've used this idea of form and freedom.
Fabulous. Well, I can't believe we're coming to the end of our show, but I have to give you a little bit more time, because our audience is made up of those people who are at various stages in their career, but they're serious about their career. So what advice would you give them? Maybe they're at a transition point. Maybe they've just entered the workforce. This aspect of form and freedom, what advice would you give them?
It actually springs back from that conversation we've just been having about values. I think one of the things, it's interesting. Every year I do a vision board. Every year I spend time to really deeply think about what is important to me in the coming year. What do I want to achieve? And one of the things several years ago that I realized was limiting my practice was this challenge around knowing what to say yes to and knowing what to say no to. If you say yes to everything, what are you saying no to? And my vision board literally had all sorts of stuff on it. And right in the middle, I cut out, because I couldn't find the word big enough in any of the magazines that I was, no. It was just this really big word, no. And so in some ways I was really digging down into that idea of what is your unapologetic core. Lesley, what is your unapologetic core? What is the work that you want to do? What is the impact that you want to have? What's the legacy that you want to leave? And it was really fascinating to take that year journey where every time I had an opportunity, I would really ask myself, is this taking you in the direction that you want to go, or is this taking you further away? Are you saying yes out of fear, or are you saying yes out of value? Mm-hmm. And it really allowed you then to distill in, this is important to me. And that's part of the warm form. That's that unapologetic core. It's not rigid, because today it might be a little bit different from tomorrow. As I grow older, some of the things that are important to me have shifted. And I now am much more thinking about legacy than I am about, maybe ambition or whatever. But taking that time to really say, these are the values that are going to ground me. These are the things that I'm going to say yes to, because they light me up. They feed my passion. They make me feel good. And I know that when I'm in that zone, I'm effective. So that would be one thing, is really know your values. And I think linked to that is also know your people. Who are the people that are important to you in your life? And Brene Brown tells a fabulous story here. I'm sure you could Google it. She's in an interview with Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah Winfrey says, I'm sure that you say things that are, offensive to some people, or you go in and you talk to CEOs about vulnerability. That can't go over well very often, or sometimes. What do you do when you get that criticism? And she says, Oprah, I have a list in my pocket and it has 5 names on it. And when something bad happens, I pull out this list and I just go, no, we're good, we're good, we're good, we're good. And as long as I feel like I haven't broken any of those deeply important relationships to me, then I know I'm doing the right thing. And I think that idea of, again, the principles, the values, which are a bit more intellectual, and the relationships, which are really, really meaningful to people, they become that core form. They become that unapologetic core. Even if I don't end up winning this contract, I still feel good about myself. Or even if I don't, even if I offend this person, I'm still moving in the right direction. And that's been very, very helpful to me in my own career. And I think that it might be helpful to other people.
Lesley, I'm sitting here thinking, this is amazing. You've been a great straight man for me. Because one of the practices that I suggest to people, if they really want to nurture their resilience, is that every day they make the decision that they're going to do the most important thing, and they do it. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's a difficult decision because you have to think about all the things that are imposing on you, your values, relationships. So it could be that after you've thought about that, you say, the most important thing for me to do today is call my mother. And that's okay, because you've really thought about it in relationship to the environment in which you're in. So this is such great advice, because it turns out that if you do that every day, you can accomplish amazing things, which I've done it myself. I'm just like, wow, it changes. And I can see it in you in terms of what you're talking about, even this morning or today on this talk. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And a double thank you for being with me today. I mean, It has been a delight, as I'm sure that anybody who is watching or listening will agree. You are so clear and articulate in what you have to say. You've thought it through. And I loved the little diagram that you gave, and the new metaphor, warm form.
Warm form. Strive for warm form. I think there was one other illustration that I sent you, which is actually out of Aristotle's work. You don't need to show it now because it can follow up if people want it. But he talks about striving always in his can't say that word, ethics. Always striving for the mean between the two extremes, and it's form and freedom is something that is so ubiquitous. Everywhere we go, every day, we're presented with these choices that are asking us to say, are you going to go down the cold end, or are you going to go up the hot end? Or how do I stay in the middle? And so, striving for that balance, for that. And resiliency is all about balance, isn't it? It's really about being able to say, how do I navigate and weather the challenges, which are not going to go away, but how do I make choices? There's that word again. How do I make choices that feed my soul, feed my passion, feed my intention, feed my work, feed my family.
Well, once again,
love it. This has been so exciting. It's so lovely to reconnect with you. I've missed you.
I agree. Well, again, thank you so much. Great appreciation for your time. Wow. What a marvelous discussion we've had here. Conversation, I should say. The forms we live in can make life easier. The challenge comes when disruptions change the form, or our own creativity disrupts our thinking. But in either case, we find ourselves in uncomfortable places. Resilience is about being prepared to be comfortable, even in those moments of discomfort. And today we explored the benefits of form. I love this warm form. Find ourselves in the middle and keeping in mind those benefits that come from living in that space and the agency that we get from being there. Well, resilience is keeping our minds open and ready to see the options and to choose the best one for us at the moment. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unlocked. If you have, comment on social media about what you learned and might do differently as a result. And I hope if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, you'll click the like button. Better yet, subscribe or follow me. And please check out my book, Unlocked, on Amazon for practices that actually work. All right. I want to thank you for joining us on this segment of Unlocked. I'm Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.